What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Insurrection Inc. podcast. We want to thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show.
All right, we're live. All right, welcome to Insurrection Inc. I'm Stratty. With me is Porter, Nick, Peter, Tim, and Jay.
And Monty.
Oh, and Monty, yeah. And our guest today, who I'm very excited to have on the show, very excited to be talking to today. He is an academic economist specializing in the economic analysis of law. He has taught at schools including DPI, UCLA, Tulane, Chicago, and Stanford. And this may be dated, but is currently on the faculty of the Santa Clara University School of Law.
Actually, I'm emeritus. I retired a couple of years ago.
Okay. But he's the great writer of this amazing book, Machinery of Freedom, Dr. David Friedman. And Dr. Friedman, thank you for being on the show today.
Happy to be here.
I believe Porter had one question he wanted to open up with. Porter?
To start, we wanted to ask you, how did you come to find anarcho-capitalism? Because I was actually reading something from the Libertarian Forum, which was published between 1969 and 1984, and edited by Murray Rothbard. And in 1972, he mentioned one of your works. I don't remember what it was exactly, but he always did a recommended reading section in the monthly publications. And one of your works, one of your really early ones, I unfortunately don't remember the title, but he recommended that for explaining private law, basically. So your work goes back a long way.
That's 1970 sounds early because that's a little before I published Machinery of Freedom.
Right.
So I was doing columns early on. I was the libertarian columnist for The New Guard, which was a publication of a mostly conservative student organization, Young Americans for Freedom. So you might possibly have seen an essay, one of my essays there. I can't think of anywhere else that early. Are you sure it was early as 1970? Because if it was 73 or 72, it could have been Machinery.
It wasn't Machinery of Freedom. I would have recognized that name. It was an essay within a YAF publication.
Uh-huh.
It was in 1970 though.
No, that certainly is possible. In fact, some of part one of Machinery is basically columns I wrote for The New Guard and a few other articles I wrote elsewhere combined into it. But I guess the answer is that I started out with a more or less classical liberal view that you needed the government for minimal functions. And I was morally a little uncomfortable with that because it was hard for me to see why the fact that the government made a law changed anything, so to speak, morally speaking. But it seemed to me that you needed a framework outside the market for the market to function. And I think what mainly persuaded me that was wrong was reading Heinlein's novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, because I thought that I had sort of a implicit proof that you couldn't have an endogenous legal system, that the legal system had to come from outside. And I hadn't ever actually sort of written it in a formal sense, but it felt right to me. And a proof is broken by a single counterexample. And what Heinlein had in that novel was, it seemed to me, was a consistent description of a society in which you did not have any government, but did have law. Law, the sort of a decentralized, really more nearly what I would now think of as a system of norms, but a system of norms which included the ability to kill people for doing certain things. And if it was possible to have such a system, then it couldn't be in general impossible. And that started me thinking about the interesting question of what in a society roughly like the one I was living in, a stateless society would look like. And that's what really produced part three of Machinery, where I sketched out an imaginary future anarchist society. And much, much, much later than that, over the last decade or two, where I got interested in existing historical legal systems, I concluded that I had really been reinventing the wheel. That what I had been describing was a sort of modern high division of labor version of something that had historically existed in many past societies. That in my most recent nonfiction book, which is called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours, I have a chapter on what I call feud law. And feud law is private, decentralized law enforcement. And it describes more or less what was happening in Saga period Iceland, what was happening in northern Somalia, what happened among the Comanche Indians, probably a bunch of other examples I don't know as well, but systems in which the basic rule was, if you wrong me, I will harm you unless you compensate me. And in order for that to work, there are a number of problems it has to solve. It's not, there are obvious problems with that system, but then there are, in the real world, interesting solutions to those problems, that there are ways in which you set it up so that I can use the threat in order to get justice, but not in order to extort you, or at least it's harder to use it for extortion, so that you have some mechanism by which you can have some sort of a trial involving neutral third parties, where other people around you will accept the result of the trial, and therefore, if after I win the case, I use force against you and you refuse to compensate me, other people don't think I'm a dangerous person, whereas if I just go around threatening people and then using force, they don't pay me off, they do. That's an oversimplified version, but essentially, if you take a look at the book, Legal Systems Very Different, the chapter on feud law runs through about 3 or 4 different problems that the system has to solve and describes ways in which some historical systems solved it. So that was really quite interesting, discovering that in a sense, what I've been picking up was corresponded, at least loosely, to some historical systems.
Yeah, and I think I've read passages of that book, but I haven't read the full thing, so I might have to pick that up. But it actually leads into another question I was planning on asking later, but since you brought it up, I'll ask it now. Since you've studied these historical private law societies with endogenous law systems like you described, which one is your favorite? Because I have a few favorites. I'm curious which one yours is.
Yeah, that's very hard to say. I haven't lived in any of them. The one I know best is Saga period Iceland, and that's because it happens to have produced one of the world's great literatures. And you can therefore actually read stuff written either at the end of the period or just after the end of the period, but by people who were familiar with that background, describing the working of that society and their interesting stories. On the other hand, Saga period Iceland, I usually refer to as a semi-stateless system, because there was no executive arm of government, so all enforcement was private, but there was a legislature and a court system, so that in principle, there was sort of 2/3 of the government, as it were, in terms of our categories. Whereas if you look at the other 2 examples I mentioned, or there are some others, you don't really even have that. You've got some mechanism for generating legal rules that people in general will accept, and you've got some mechanism for arbitrating disputes, but you don't really have anything that corresponds very closely to a legislature, court system, etc., which Iceland did have. So I guess the system I like best, because I know it best, is Iceland, but I wouldn't say that's true in general. And in fact, there are feud systems existing at present. One of my other chapters is about the Romani, the Gypsies, and it turns out that at least as of 1980 or so, maybe still, the American Romani were running a feud system, as it were, below the radar of the official legal system in the U.S. And I suspect they're not the only people doing that. And the funny thing about the Romani feud system in America was that we were one of their weapons. That one of the ways that a Romani gets another Romani is to go to the police and accuse the other Romani of some crime, which he may or may not have actually committed. Romani do not always do only legal things, so he might actually be guilty, he might not be guilty, but you can get somebody else in trouble that way. And until he backs down and compensates you for whatever wrong he's done to you, you don't withdraw your charges. And then once he does back down, well, you just don't show up when the police want to talk to you, and eventually the situation goes away. So there's quite a fascinating book written by a woman who lived with a Romani community fairly close to where I live. I would guess an hour or two from here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And she was interacting with them for, I don't know, 6 months or a year or something, an anthropologist. And she didn't tell them that she had learned their language reasonably well, but in fact, it sounds as though she had. And then she describes the society. It's generally a pretty sympathetic portrait of a rather alien to us society. But she then wrote another book a couple of years ago, in which although she's never willing to say so, what she's really describing is the breakdown of that system. And so I don't want to swear that it's true at the moment, but parts of it probably are still around. So anyway, that was I should say the book isn't just about stateless systems. That is, the first chapter is about imperial China, which was very far from a stateless system, but is interesting in part because it lasted with occasional intermissions for about 2,000 years. And that's a very long time. And it's a strange and interesting system, like as many of the other ones are. And I've got lots of others. Now, one of the other interesting ones is 18th century England, because that's not as stateless as Iceland, but that was a system where criminal law was privately prosecuted, where you don't have police and public prosecutors. So if you were robbed, it's up to you or somebody you hire for the purpose to find out who did it, bring the evidence to court, and win the case. And that raised a whole bunch of interesting puzzles, starting out with why anybody bothered, because in criminal law, unlike tort law, you don't get to collect damages. So that was sort of, I guess, probably my two longest chapters are the 18th century English legal system and Saga period Iceland, both of which started out as journal articles. And I wrote those over a period of some years, concluded that they'd really been a lot of fun and I'd learned lots of interesting stuff, and then decided I needed a commitment strategy, a way of forcing myself to do more such work. So I announced a seminar at the law school on legal systems very different from ours that I was going to teach the next year, and then I had to get enough information to teach it. And that's what the book ultimately came out of, the stuff I did for that seminar.
So speaking of stateless societies and such, I think something that's really pertinent right now that a lot of people, especially libertarians, do have a question about would be, how would a stateless society handle a pandemic like this? Because a lot of people have asked that, but there's a lot of anarcho-capitalist economists that don't like to make too many predictions. But
I think the answer is that it would do better in some ways and worse in others. That one of the points that people pushing an ideology are reluctant to make is that no system deals with everything perfectly. That is always a choice among imperfect systems. So while I think my preferred system is anarcho-capitalism, I could certainly imagine environments in which it wouldn't work. And I just see machinery. I mean, I discussed what seem to me the two different potentials for breakdowns of that system. And if you consider the pandemic case, the argument against freedom in general is that when I choose to take risks of getting infected, I am imposing a cost not only on myself, but on the other people who might catch it from me. That's not too much of a problem because a large part of the cost goes to me. So although I don't have what an economist would call the optimal incentive to take precautions, I still have pretty strong incentives to take precautions. I, in fact, have been self-quarantining for well over a month now, along with my family, and we started doing that before the governor told us to, basically, or the mayor, or whoever it was who made the decision here. But the second, more serious problem is that if you are or might be contagious, you have only a weak incentive to protect other people. So in that sense, it's clear that if everybody just does what's in his own rational interest, you will get a less good result than if a sufficiently wise authority told everybody what to do and made them do it. But we're sort of short of sufficiently wise authorities. And if you look at what's actually happened, it's pretty clear that there are several ways in which governments made things worse. The general way is that we almost certainly have substantially fewer medicines than we would have if the FDA didn't exist. My favorite sort of factoid on that is an old statistical article by Sam Peltzman, who is an economist at Chicago, in which he analyzed the effect of one change in the FDA rules. That it was a amendment to the FDA rules, to the legislation creating the FDA essentially, which said that in order for it to be legal to bring out a drug, you had to not only show it was safe, but also show that it was useful. It was actually an improvement on what was actually there. I think that's a correct statement. And so Peltzman analyzed the effect of that. And he concluded that just that one change had reduced the rate at which new drugs were being offered roughly in half. And it had no measurable effect on their average quality. He had a number of proxies for trying to judge after the fact how good a drug was. And he concluded that didn't change. Well, that suggests that the overall effect of the FDA is to reduce much more than by a factor of 2 of the number of medicines we have. Similarly, the various government restrictions on building hospitals, the fact that basically if you want to open a new center for treating some disease, you in effect need the permission of whoever else is already doing it, because otherwise the government won't give you permission to build your center. Medical licensing in general has been used for a long time to restrict the number of physicians. The system is now used, as I understand it, to restrict what things nurses are allowed to do and other paramedics. So to begin with, I think if the government weren't getting in the way, we would have a substantially better medical system. Second, and specifically, the existing regulations, I think almost everybody knows at this point, the government said nobody can use any tests except our tests.
Yep.
And then the tests they made available didn't work. And that cost a month or so before they eventually backed down. And that was the point at which there were tests for the contagion that were already being used elsewhere in the world. It was not, some random thing that we weren't allowed to use. Similarly, the CDC for a fair while told us not to wear masks. They then switched and told us we should wear masks. As far as I can tell, there was no additional data that was based on. That the blog that I was mentioning to you earlier, Slate Star Codex, which is my favorite place online, the person who runs that blog is a young psychiatrist with a very wide range of interests and enormous intellectual energy. And he had an article before the CDC changed its position, in which he simply surveyed all of the published articles giving evidence on the effectiveness of masks. And it was reasonably clear from that although nobody knew exactly how effective they were in preventing this, that masks had a substantial effect in reducing the chance that you would pass the disease on to someone else, and at least a mild effect in reducing the chance you would get the disease. So the CDC was telling us to do exactly the opposite of the right thing to do for, a month or so. At present, I'm not sure how much of the present situation is government regulation and how much is just medical ethics and norms. But if you think about the problem of testing a vaccine, the current way of testing a vaccine they hope will work, is you give the vaccine to a bunch of people, and you then wait and see how many of them get the disease. That's a whole lot slower than if you give the vaccine to a bunch of people and deliberately expose them to the disease. Well, for healthy young people, the evidence suggests that the chance of dying from the disease is something around 1 in 1,000, maybe a little bit higher than that. We don't really know. We don't have accurate data. It's looking now from a number of attempts to randomly test population to see what percentage have been infected, that the lethality of the disease is substantially lower than was initially estimated. And I think what the figures are suggesting is that the overall lethality is somewhere around 1%. And a large part of that is elderly people, which is why I'm self-quarantining. And if that's right, then that suggests that for healthy young people, it's more like a 0.1%, or 0.2%. So you give it to 1,000 people, and probably one of them dies. That's a real cost, but people do lots of things where there's one chance in 1,000 of dying. But the result of that is that you find whether the vaccine works a month or two earlier than you would if you just wait for random infection to do it. You've got much better data, because if you wait for random infection, then you get a whole lot of noise in the signal due to the fact that you don't know how much people are being exposed. Getting a vaccine a month earlier is going to save a whole lot more than one life, but we don't do it. So I think there are a variety of ways in which, on the one hand, if people are perfectly free to do what they like, they will be less careful about wearing masks than they ought to be. Although on the other hand, at least in the US, they aren't making people wear masks anyway, if you're just recommending it. They will be less careful about not getting together in groups in ways that might spread it. But still, most reasonable people will be pretty careful. Mm-hmm. And most elderly people who can afford to do it will do what I'm doing and self-quarantine to varying degrees. And of course, elderly people are likely to be retired, especially people who are substantially elderly, and therefore are in a position where they can self-quarantine if they want to. So my guess is, though I am not certain, that a stateless America would treat the disease somewhat better rather than somewhat worse than the current one. I should say, on the general issue of what to do, the strategy I've been thinking about, I'm not sure if it's the right strategy, is a more extreme version of the Swedish model. That is to say, you get everybody who is vulnerable to self-quarantine, and then you let everybody else do whatever they please. I've done some very rough calculations, and if I've worked it out right, if you are willing to use a quarter of the hospital beds in the US for people who are hopefully recovering from the disease, it would take about 6 months for the entire non-elderly population to get infected and go to the hospital, and a few of them die and most of them not die. At which point, assuming, as we assume but we're not certain, that once you've got it you're immune, you then have a herd immunity population. You have a population where very few people can get the disease. You now let the old people out, and everything's over, so that the non-medical costs of that procedure are much lower than what we're doing, because you never have a lockdown. And it's actually over in 6 months instead of God knows how long now, a year and a half maybe, to get a vaccine, if we get a vaccine. I'm not sure that's the right strategy, because it really depends on rather uncertain numbers about what the real lethality is, what fraction of those people require medical care, and so forth. But I think it's at least one of the options one ought to think about.
Oh, Dr. Friedman, adding up upon that, what if basically businesses in a stateless society would have their workers get tested in order to work? Would that also be a possible solution to preventing the pandemic spread among some healthy people? By if the worker is tested as infected, they're allowed to basically, the business doesn't allow them to work until they're immune.
Yeah, that could easily happen, and you can in fact take it one step further, namely have testing in which people can demonstrate that they are immune, that they've already had the disease, and you would expect that such people would command a wage premium, because you know that you're not going to have to send them home when they get the disease, and that they're not passing it on to someone. So I think there are a variety of market mechanisms which would certainly do an imperfect job, but which would substantially reduce it. That individual people are going to be most people are going to be trying to distance just to protect themselves. That firms are going to be trying to make sure that the people working there don't have the disease, either to protect their fellow workers and to protect their customers. I think it's Amazon, which has been installing infrared cameras, which are essentially thermometers that don't require you to get close to somebody. So that, if I understand it correctly, at least in some of the locations, each person who comes in is having his temperature checked as he comes in, and if his temperature is higher than normal, he's sent home. So there are a fair number of things of that sort you could do. My point is only you would not do a perfect job of it, because the costs to you of getting somebody infected are lower than the costs to the world of getting someone infected. So again, there are certainly ways in which a government could make things better. I wouldn't be surprised if a general rule against large meetings, for example, really produced benefits and might not happen in a stateless society, although there would certainly be many fewer large meetings as people were taking precautions. But you have to look not at is there anything good the government can do, but whether the good things the government can do add up to more than the bad things the government can do. And this isn't just limited to the pandemic, that I think it's a mistake for libertarians to claim there is nothing where the government makes things better. That the right claim you want to make is we have no mechanism to limit governments to doing things where they do things better. And on the evidence, and I think on the theory, we can expect governments to do lots of things where they make things worse, and therefore on net we are better off if governments don't have the power to make the decision of what they do.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Who wants to ask a question next?
Well, I'll ask Body by Liberty's question. So one listener had a question for you, and he wanted to ask this. Do you still support school voucher programs as a replacement for the Department of Education funding schools directly? And if so, how would this not just contribute to already spiraling education costs the way subsidized loans do with universities?
Yeah, I guess the obvious answer is that if you, at the moment, something like 90%, I think over 90% of school-age kids are going to public schools. So if you have a voucher for the amount presently being sent per kid available to everybody, then at most your costs go up by 10% because it's now covering the people who are not in school. If you have a voucher for 90% of the amount now being sent, I don't know if people appreciate how expensive the present schooling system is, but you're talking in the U.S. of something like $10,000 or $11,000 per kid per year. That's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So if you make it your voucher for $9,000, now, well, generally what voucher proponents have proposed is not closing down the public schools. Of course, the public schools aren't run by the Department of Education. Public schooling is run at the state and local level. But the usual proposal is not that you close down the public schools, but that you offer a voucher for something like the amount spent per pupil in the public schools, and then see what happens. And if as many of us suspect, private firms can produce schooling at a higher quality and lower cost than government firms, which seems to be the usual experience in other industries, then over time, more and more people will shift to private schools. The public schools will get somewhat better because they have to compete for customers, which puts some pressure on them to behave better. And you will then end up with some sort of a mixed public-private system. I have no objection to shutting down the public schools and entirely replacing them by vouchers, but I think that's a more radical proposal than necessary to get the effect, and therefore generally what voucher proponents push is the simpler version. But then in terms of overall costs, I don't think our usual experience is that socialist industries are more efficient than market industries, and that's really, the public school system is, I think, the largest socialist industry in the U.S. It's a local socialist industry, not a national socialist industry, since it's run at the state and local level, but it is an industry run entirely by governments.
Yeah. Monty, you said you had a question in the chat?
1 second.
Yep.
Yeah, then I can also go ahead and maybe ask a question.
Yep. Well, Nicholas gets his ready. Go ahead, Tim.
All right. So besides the Chicago School of Economics, when it comes to anarcho-capitalism, there's obviously also the Austrian School of Economics. And I wanted to ask you, where and why do you disagree with the Austrian School of Economics, especially when it comes to praxeology?
Yeah. Part of the problem there is that not all people who consider themselves Austrians agree with each other. And what I disagree with is the extreme methodological claim that some Austrians, I think probably including Rothbard, would make, which essentially treats economics as entirely an a priori science. And the problem with that, I think, is that there are essentially no real world propositions, at least I can't think of any, that you can, observable real world propositions that you can deduce from economics without some real world data, without some actual evidence. So, for example, one of the things which I think most serious economists, Austrian or Chicago, would say is pretty obvious, is that if you raise the minimum wage, the number of low-skilled workers who are employed will go down. That's just saying that a demand curve slopes in the usual direction. But with a little bit of effort, you could imagine a real-world situation in which that wasn't true. The one I've usually offered is to imagine that there are a whole lot of people who really dislike the idea that the goods they are buying are produced by low-wage labor. And the only easy way of convincing them that these goods are not produced by low-wage labor is to have a minimum wage law of some level that they are happy with. When you do that, they are much more willing to buy the kinds of goods produced by unskilled labor, so the demand for those goods goes up, so the number of people employed goes up. Now, as it happens, some clever economists actually produced a more plausible theory of why, under some circumstances, raising the minimum wage would not lower employment. And they produced some, I think, very weak empirical evidence for the claim. But my real point is that if you're sufficiently agnostic about things like production functions and utility functions, about what people value and how you produce something, then economics has no predictive power at all. So that in my view, the right way of doing economics is you use the theory to produce plausible guesses, to produce things that you think are probably true given your view of what the world is like. You then test those plausible guesses against real world evidence. And if it turns out that the predictions that those guesses give you don't pan out, you then revise your theory. And that's what I see as the Chicago approach, so that you are certainly using economic theory to start with, but you're then testing it against the real world. And as it happens, I have a real world experience with this. The very first economics journal article I ever wrote was an economic theory of the size and shape of nations. It was an attempt to explain the general characteristics of the map of Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present, in terms of how big nations were and what shape they were. And started out with a puzzle, a historical puzzle that nobody else seemed to have noticed, which was when the Roman Empire fell, why did it break? That the Roman Empire was a superstate, sort of roughly the size of the EU. Why is it that the post-Roman world, after a while, consisted of a whole lot of tiny states? And I constructed an economic theory I was reasonably happy with about that. And I wrote a journal article, and I submitted it to the Journal of Political Economy, which was run by George Stigler, who I had known since I was a small child because he was one of my father's best friends, and he rejected it. And he rejected it on the grounds that in order to be published in his journal, there had to be some empirical tests of the theory. And he had some suggestions, none of which worked, for how to test the theory. But I thought about the problem, and I figured out some predictions that could actually be tested with available data. And I revised the article accordingly, and it was published. That was my first published journal article in the Journal of Political Economy. And the interesting thing was that while that gave me some evidence my theory was true, it also forced me to think the theory through much more carefully. That as long as you're only talking about something, you don't have to be all that precise. Whereas when the question is, how would I test it? What real world facts would support or contradict this theory? You have to be much more careful and much more precise of what the theory was. So I have been grateful to George ever since for that lesson. And from my standpoint, I think that the rule of create your theory, make predictions, test if they're true, is useful both as a way of improving the process of making theories and as a way of filtering out those theories that turn out to be wrong, which some theories, of course, will. Now, beyond that, so I say that's my basic disagreement with some versions of the Austrian model. Beyond that, as far as I can tell, the largest predictive disagreement between some Austrian economists and Chicago economists is on macroeconomics, on theories of basically the Depression and business cycles and such. I don't work in that area, so I assume, since the people I trust are Chicago school people, they're probably right, but I'm not really competent to hold an opinion on that question. As best I can tell, my father's view was that the Austrian model of the business cycle was theoretically possible, but did not fit the available evidence. And I think I can remember, I think his discussing or somewhat discussing ways in which he felt that Rothbard had, in effect, tortured the data till it confessed. That is, interpreted historical evidence in non-obvious ways in order to make it consistent. But again, that's not stuff that I know enough about to have my own opinion on.
All right, thank you.
To add on to that, I have one short question. Do you think that there's any possibility that any economic theory could be apodictically certain, that we can know a priori is certain, or do you think that every theory has to be tested empirically in order for us to be totally?
I think that every implication of a theory for the real world has to be tested. That okay. you can always make the theory logically straight by implicitly putting assumptions about the real world into your definitions. So if you say what happens in such and such a situation if, well, take the simple case. So take my minimum wage case. Somebody could say, but what's happened is that they're now producing a different good. That really low-skilled workers who are known to be well paid are producing a different good, namely goods produced by low-skilled workers known to be well paid. Consequently, I've really changed the facts of the story, and the prediction only applies if you hold everything else constant and change the minimum wage. But when you take that line, you then lose all possibility of making real-world predictions, because you're going to define out of existence any factors that make your prediction wrong. So I guess I would say that I at least can't think of any real-world propositions in economics. If you think of a proposition such as printing more money will make prices go up, or raising the minimum wage will increase unemployment among low-skilled workers, those are propositions which seem to be very likely to be true, but I don't think that you can rigorously prove them on theoretical grounds.
Makes sense.
Monty, did you want to get your question, Monty?
Yeah, he answered half of it with the business cycle part, but so since that's one Austrian business cycle theory, that's one major problem some Austrians have with central banks or fractional reserve banks. Do you have an opinion on central banking?
Sure, but central banking and fractional reserve banking are two wholly different issues, since private banks can also be fractional reserve. And when Adam Smith was writing, the monetary system of Scotland was being produced by competing private banks, which were using fractional reserve system. Yeah, no, that's an interesting case. There are two different claims. One of them is that fractional reserve banking has bad effects. I don't think that's correct. The other is that it is fraud, and I think that's clearly false. Because if you claim, the claim is it is possible. A fractional reserve bank does not normally claim to have 100% reserves. That would be fraud. A fractional reserve bank claims that if you bring in their notes, they will give you silver for it, or whatever the reserve commodity is. They expect to be able to fulfill that claim. There is some probability they won't be able to. But of course, that's true of essentially any contract that anybody makes, that an insurance company is contracting to pay you money if your house burns down. They know that if enough houses burn down, they'll go bankrupt and they won't be able to fulfill that contract. As long as they don't lie to you about the facts, that's not fraud. So I think the libertarian moral argument against fractional reserve banking is complete nonsense. And as far as I can tell, this is pure deduction. I have no evidence on this. The reason Rothbard made that argument was that he wanted to prohibit fractional reserve banking because he thought they caused business cycles. And in order to prohibit them as a libertarian, he had to have some excuse for claiming they were a rights violation. Otherwise, he's violating rights by prohibiting them. Hence, he cooks up this crazy claim that they're fraud. Now, beyond that, I don't see any particular reason to see. I mean, I guess I would have said that my ideal monetary system would be money issued by competing private banks using fractional reserve system, ideally based not on a single commodity, but on a commodity bundle. Because one of the weaknesses of a commodity system, whether fractional reserve or 100% reserve, is that if that particular commodity for some reason gets much cheaper or much less expensive, that's going to mess up a whole bunch of other things because people have made all their contracts in those units and the units have just changed. And the straightforward solution to that is that you say that what I'm guaranteeing to give you when you bring in Friedman dollars, if you bring in $1 Friedman, I won't give you anything. It's too much trouble. But if you bring in 1 million Friedman dollars, I then would guarantee to give you 50 pounds of the following quality of steel, this many bushels of wheat, some list of commodities, which is broad enough so that it is extremely unlikely that the average price of all of them will change very much. You can think of that bundle as, roughly speaking, a price index, although it's only going to have to be, it's limited to goods you can actually sell to people. So then you would have a stable commodity basis. And I see no particular reason why that would be an unstable system. But as I say, the details of Austrian business cycle theory are not something I really have the expertise to critique. But the problem with a 100% reserve system is, first, you can't maintain it without violating rights, because if you have a 100% reserve bank, you have to charge people for using your money. Whereas or for using your checking account, say, whereas I have a 20% fractional reserve system, I can pay people to use my money because I'm collecting the interest on 80% of what they've given me. That makes sense. All right. So therefore, a 100% reserve system is not going to be able to compete in a free market. And the reason it can't compete is that it's substantially less efficient, because you have a whole bunch of gold or something else that somebody has paid to mine, and which is sitting there not being used, whereas that gold could be used to make beautiful jewelry, to make the connections in electronic material work better because gold doesn't corrode, and so forth. So I don't really see any good. I shouldn't overstate it. There have been good economists who were in favor of 100% reserve systems, but I don't think the position was correct.
Yeah, that leads me to a question about, we've seen a boom in private currency that seems to have been issued by really no one, in particular with cryptocurrency. So I would like to know, what's your take on that so far, since it's become such a hot button issue in libertarian spheres?
Yeah, I'm in favor of privately issued currency. Cryptocurrency is a very, very clever idea. So far, it's not clear to me that any of the cryptocurrencies are a really adequate replacement for conventional fiat money as we now have it. That what you want is a currency. What you want is a currency where the transaction cost of working with it is low. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's the case. And you also want a currency with a reasonably stable value. And that isn't the case. The Bitcoin goes up and down by quite a lot. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I certainly have no objection in principle. What I've advocated for a long time is fully anonymous eCash. And unfortunately, none of the cryptocurrencies are fully anonymous. Although there are a number of projects that are trying to make moderately anonymous versions of cryptocurrency. I haven't followed the current status of that at this point. And the system, which back before there were cryptocurrencies, the system that I discussed in some of the stuff I wrote was Chaumian digital cash. David Chaum is a Dutch cryptographer who worked out elegant mathematical ways in which you could have money where I could make a payment to you by sending you a message. I didn't have to know who you were, You didn't have to know who I was, and the bank holding the money never had to know who either of us was. So that was a fully anonymous eCash. And the problem with Xiaomi and digital cash is it requires a bank. It requires some organization which is actually holding assets, paying and receiving and so forth. And it requires a bank in a country where people are willing to trust banks, which almost certainly means a developed country. Once you have anonymous eCash, money laundering laws become unenforceable. Consequently, the governments of modern developed countries very much don't want anonymous eCash to come into existence. Consequently, there's a serious problem getting a bank issuing such an eCash to exist anywhere. So that was why the very clever idea of Xiaomi and anonymous eCash didn't come into existence. The beautiful thing about Bitcoin is it doesn't require an issuer, it doesn't require a bank. It's a really decentralized system, which is quite beautiful. But as I say, it's got a number of flaws such that it's not yet replacing ordinary currencies.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As someone who follows it very closely, I agree with a lot of those problems.
Other questions?
Yeah. So now that we're on the topic of cryptocurrency, which has been considered, one of the main, I guess, pillars of libertarian strategy. A lot of people are really excited about it. Although I do agree with your criticism of how exactly it could be implemented. What else do you have to say about libertarian strategy? I know you talked about it a little bit in the Machinery of Freedom, and specifically, do you agree with the people who call themselves agorists or agorists, depending on how you pronounce it, who want to use counter-economic strategy, trade on the black and gray markets to essentially outcompete the state? What do you think of that?
Well, that's fine if you can do it. I think to me, a more attractive option is developing institutions which replace particular government activities in a reasonably open and visible way. So I would have said that the fact that my packages are more often delivered by UPS than by the post office represents a step in the right direction. That I think the idea of developing alternative institutions, one of the things I'd really like to see is if somebody could develop a good, cheap private school. Because at the moment, the problem with private schools is that they are competing with a heavily subsidized competitor, namely the public schools. So if you have a choice between going to the public school and going to a private school that costs $11,000 a year, which is about what the public school is costing, the private school has to be a lot better before you're willing to take that. And so one solution would be if an entrepreneur can figure out a way of making a private school that costs $2,000 a year. And it's not clear to me that that's undoable, but nobody seems to have done it so far. Similarly, of course, if you can make homeschooling more viable, that's another obvious alternative. And of course, a voucher program is a way of making private schools more competitive by reducing the relevant subsidy. So I think developing institutions that replace the government in various ways is certainly a large step in the right direction. I think black market, not anything against black markets, but the cost of operating on a black market, the fact that there are a lot of things you can't usually do, reduces how much it's going to be able to compete. I'm thinking about other things along those lines. I guess I don't think there is sort of one silver bullet for getting rid of government, unfortunately, and that it seems to me that the two main lines of offense are either developing institutions which substitute for government or changing people's ideas. And that I like to say that you can think of a democratic system as sort of like the old microscopes that have a coarse focus knob and a fine focus knob. And the fine focus knob in our system is special interest lobbying. Special interests actually know what they're doing. The coarse focus is democratic voting driven by free information. That given that each voter knows that his vote has essentially no effect, it isn't worth getting the kind of information you would get before you decided which car to buy when you're deciding who to vote for. Consequently, what drives that is what everybody knows, or what you know anyway. And one can modify that by being a professor teaching different things, by being a novelist writing different novels, by running a television show which puts forth libertarian information. There are a whole bunch of different mechanisms by which you can do it. You may be able to do some of that by running again. What?
Hosting a podcast.
Or hosting a podcast. That's right. That's right. This is an example of exactly that approach. So those are both useful, but the other thing with regard to at least some of the agoric stuff is there's a tendency for libertarians to imagine that the ideal economy is one in which there are no firms, is one in which everybody in effect is subcontracting. And that has some attractive features, but it also has some unattractive features. That Ronald Coase, who was a very important economist, wrote 2 articles, on the basis of which he won a Nobel Prize. And one of them is called The Theory of the Firm. And in it, he points out that if you assume a world of zero transaction costs, there's no reason to have any firms, that everything would be done by all of the participants in production contracting with each other. But in fact, we aren't in that world. And that given a world of positive transaction costs, there is a trade-off between the centralized model of the firm and the decentralized model of the market. And it's not the case, as libertarians would like to imagine, the decentralized model always works better. If it were, we would have much fewer and smaller firms than we do. That there are costs to the decentralized model as well as costs to the centralized model. And therefore, in a competitive market, what you end up with is firms that expand up to the point at which moving one more thing into the firm would cost more in the inefficiencies associated with central control than it would gain in the efficiencies associated with central control, so to speak, associated with avoiding market transaction costs. So anyway, so I guess in that sense, I was a more enthusiastic believer in the agoric approach 40 or 50 years ago than I am now, because since then, Coase wrote the article and I read the article, and I think he's right. Anyway, so that would be a different discussion. But I think, and it turns out, in fact, that there was something closer to the agoric model in the 19th century, what was referred to as the inside contracting system, where you would have one building. In my example, I'm not sure if my example is a real one or imaginary. You have one building where you're producing rifles, and there are 4 or 5 different firms. And one firm makes the stock for the rifle, and one makes the action, and one makes the barrel, and one assembles them, and one markets them. And they all contract with each other. And that was the inside contracting system. And it has some advantages, because each of those firms is a very small organization. The boss is there on the factory floor watching what's happening and so forth. But on the other hand, if the people who are making the stocks manage to mess up, then everybody else shuts down for a month until they can solve their problem and start producing stocks again. So it's hard to contractually coordinate well enough, and the actual result was that system eventually lost out to the integrated firm, where one firm did all of it. So that's sort of a different sense in which you can talk about agorism, or the agoric system of economy. Now, I think moving towards a more agoric economy is probably desirable, but not all the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the view of the like everybody's an individual contractor, there are no firms whatsoever, is probably my biggest disagreement with Samuel Konkin's views and stuff about agorism. But,
yes,
thank you. That's interesting. Any other questions?
Yeah, you might actually want to read Coase's essay, which is I think called "The Theory of the Firm," because that was sort of a groundbreaking essay, and like most of Coase's stuff, it's readable. Anyway,
I have actually read it. Yeah,
good.
Mm-hmm.
I think Tim had a question.
Yeah, like libertarians are really split regarding their opinion on how to achieve a stateless society, basically. So some support secession, some support decentralization, others support counter-economics, others even support like parties as the Libertarian Party. So my question would be, which strategy do you support in order to achieve a stateless society?
Well, to begin with, I'm a conservative in the literal, not the political sense of the term. That is to say, I think that rapid change is unlikely to work very well. I don't agree with Rothbard's. If there was a button I could push that would stop the state, I would do it. I think that would just result in being replaced by another and worse state. So I want to look at ways at forms of continuous change. I think it is unlikely that one strategy is right for everybody. And that's a mistake libertarians ought not to make, that different people have different talents and different interests. And if I persuade everybody that the only right thing to do is to campaign for libertarian candidates, then all of the libertarians who don't enjoy campaigning for libertarian candidates and aren't interested in doing it will go home and not do anything. That the mistake that I think many ideologies, not just libertarians, but it's worse for libertarians, that it's less defensible for libertarians make, is that they imagine that there's a pool of libertarian resources. And if you persuade people to follow your preferred strategy, that's diverting resources from the pool that should be used to follow my preferred strategy. And that's wrong, because the resources all belong to individual libertarians. And for some libertarians, the thing that they can do that they are competent to do, will enjoy doing, and is the most effective thing they can do, is to work on a Republican candidate's campaign and try to introduce libertarian elements to it. For others, the most interesting thing is to work on a campaign for a libertarian candidate where they know it's not going to win, but they can use it to spread ideas. For a few people, the best thing they can do is to write a novel. Ayn Rand had an enormous effect by writing novels. George Bernard Shaw had an enormous effect by writing plays. That's something that very few people can do, but those who do it, that's the right thing for them to do. For an entrepreneur, the best thing you can do might be to start Uber, or to start UPS, or to start some other market institution which makes the government look less essential, so to speak. So those are all things that you can do. If you are mainly worried about gun control, one of the things you can do that people are doing is to design guns that you can make at home via 3D printing. I've seen some very clever stuff along those lines where somebody's actually figured out a way you can make a rifled barrel without having a 3D printer that can print steel, because I'm not sure if there are any, but if they are, they cost a fortune, but by an indirect method. So that's a particular way, a particular clever person solved one little tiny problem that libertarians are concerned with. Anyway, so I don't think there is a correct answer, but the answer that I think is probably incorrect is revolution. I think that usually has bad effects.
Yeah, we all agree with that here.
Yeah.
But the New City projects, which my son Patri is involved in investments in, strike me as one attractive possibility. Certainly Hong Kong was a spectacular success for our side. And it'd be nice if we get 50 or 100 more of those. But the people who can do that, that's not something I'm doing. That is what I'm doing. It's what I'm doing at the moment. And, writing books at the moment, what I'm doing is taking the books I've written and turning them into audiobooks. That's something I'm competent to do, probably better at doing than anybody else would be doing for my own books. Different people have different skills and different interests. And we ought to, as libertarians, we ought to take that for granted and then work with it.
So I wanted to ask a question regarding, and well, I'm really curious to actually hear this after hearing some of the things you've already said regarding anarchism and what you just said about revolution. So something that has been coming up a lot in anarchist circles amongst people our ages is the idea of left-right unity among libertarians and anarchists. So I wanted to know, what do you think about the idea of that, and what do you think, what are the prospects you see coming of it if that were to happen?
Part of the problem is that I think left anarchy describes more than one thing. That the fundamental problem I see with the versions of left anarchy that I've mostly seen is that they have no solution to the coordination problem. They have no way within an anarchist society of making sure that if you want to make a car, somebody else is making enough steel and enough glass and so forth, because they've rejected the form of decentralized coordination, namely the market, that right anarchists are in favor of. On the other hand, I think James Scott might, well, he doesn't quite call himself an anarchist. He's got a book called, I think, Two Cheers for Anarchy. James Scott clearly thinks of himself as a left-winger. And yet I think if you look at his books, they are stuff that libertarians ought to read and will largely agree with. And in fact, one of the things I found amusing reading one of his books was the effort he made to make it clear he wasn't one of those icky right-wing libertarians. He has a couple of unkind comments about us, which are really have not much to do with what he's actually saying. But the actual content of the books are very good stuff. And, you know, he's somebody I'm a fan of his writings. My conclusion when I interacted with James Scott, was that on those things he had thought about, he had generally interesting, original, and possibly correct views. And on those things he hadn't thought about, he more or less had conventional left-wing views. I can live with that. Beyond that, I'm not sure I know enough of what the left anarchist subculture is among people your age to be able to have any opinion on whether they are people who right anarchists can work with or not.
From my experience, no.
Yeah, I was going to say that as well. But that was a very good answer, and thank you. That was a great answer. Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any philosophical questions?
Yeah, I have one that actually, when I was reading through Machinery of Freedom, that really stuck out to me as very interesting, is that, you know, obviously you share this view that the state is made up of criminals, but that you take a different view than what, you know, Albert J. Nock or Mayor Rothbard might have had, that's one cartel of criminals, but it's actually a series of competing criminals, which is why the market hasn't done away with them. So I would like to know how you came to that, because that's a very novel view that really stuck out to me.
Are you talking about the rent-seeking discussion in Machinery? The fact that is, I've got a chapter on the non-existence of the ruling class, and that may be what you're thinking of.
Yes, and
the argument basically is that the government doesn't. I mean, describing them as criminals is a little tricky, because criminal usually means somebody breaks the law, and mostly they're not breaking the law because they make the law. But I think that if you think about the political system, about any system where people can spend resources in order to transfer rather than to create, and that applies to a private criminal, it also applies to a lobbyist, that in any such system, people spend resources transferring, and that consumes actual resources and makes the whole society poorer. And in the sort of standard analysis of the economics of crime, of robbery or mugging or something, if you assume that there are lots of roughly equally talented people who want to pick your pocket, they are going to compete with each other until the cost of picking pockets is up to just about the benefit of picking pockets, because as long as that's not the case, more people will go into the industry. And I argue that essentially the same thing is true about the political situation, that it's a different mechanism for picking pockets, but nonetheless, you're going to be spending resources in order to benefit yourself correctly. But meanwhile, other people are benefiting themselves at the cost of you. You're benefiting yourself at the cost of them. Almost everybody ends up worse off. That would be my view. So more generally, I think Rothbard, there's an essay by Rothbard, which is up on the web somewhere, explaining what's wrong with me. And he's right, except for the wrong part, except for the judgment, that his view is that what's wrong with me is I don't hate the state. And I don't. I regard the state as a mistake, not as a criminal conspiracy. If it were a criminal conspiracy, it would do a much more efficient job of transferring money from the rest of us to them, which isn't what I think you observe. And I think that taking the attitude of hating the state has bad, aside from being wrong, it also has bad consequences, because you then get the all's fair in love and war meme, as it were. And once you think about it as simply a war against evil people, there's no reason you should restrict yourself to telling the truth. And I guess my main critique of Rothbard's, I don't think he does. And that's not, I think it's true of lots of people, not just libertarians, that I think if you think about the sort of whole right-left conflict in the US, one result is that people are a whole lot less scrupulous about making sure the arguments that they make are arguments they really believe in, because they say, yes, but there are those evil people over there. If I limit myself, I tie my hands by only being honest, I'm going to lose out to them. And I think that's a mistake. Unfortunate attitude. If people are curious, the other place where you can read lots of my writing is on my blog, which is not very active at the moment because I've been spending most of my blogging time on someone else's blog. But it ran for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, and there's a big accumulation of stuff. My blog is called Ideas, and you can find essays on a lot of things, including a couple of essays on my disagreements with Rothbard, but also essays on climate change and unschooling. And for a little while, I was defending a number of Republican candidates who were being accused of being more nutty than they actually were, and stuff of that sort.
Well, actually, I did one question that I got from reading your blog, and it was something I had read about. You had a book, or had an idea for a book that was an economics book, but it revolved around World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
Working on that, I just really wanted to ask that. You're not.
It was an idea, and maybe at some point I will try writing that. The idea was basically that World of Warcraft was a environment millions of people were familiar with, and that there were interesting economic lessons in it. And I'm not sure I would have a book length enough stuff for a book. What I thought I might do, and maybe I will try, but probably won't, was a series of blog posts, each of which was taking some feature of World of Warcraft. And I think I had the beginning of that in a couple of, I think I had one or two posts in which I was doing that, and taking, in particular, non-obvious things. As the obvious thing is that the auction house is a market. And I guess part of what inspired me was many, many years ago, my wife, who was much more active on World of Warcraft than I was, especially on the auction house, was producing something, and there was someone else there who was trying to cartelize the particular set of goods that she was producing, and tried to persuade her to join the cartel, and then threatened to engage in predatory pricing to drive her out of the market if she didn't join the cartel. And apparently had not read the classic article on the Standard Oil case, which suggests reasons why predatory pricing doesn't work, and tried it and gave up after a few days. And that was sort of an interesting case. But more generally, I mean, there's lots of stuff. If you think about, are there efficient markets? One of the things I've never looked into, but I'm sure there are people who have, is to what degree do market prices change predictably between the weekend and the week? Do they change by enough to make up for the house cut on the auction house? If so, that would suggest a failure of efficient markets hypothesis in that particular context. So there are interesting possibilities if I run out of other things to do. My other project, which I also haven't worked on for a while, but may go back to, at the moment, I'm really not writing any books, to be honest. I'm just recording books I've already written. But the other project, which is on my website, partly done, is a collection of short works of literature with interesting economics in them. And I've got probably enough such works, although I'm always interested if people can suggest other things. And it's critical that what I mean by economics is not the study of the economy. It's the implications of the assumption of rational action, essentially. And I've got a Poole Anderson short story, which is deliberately making an economic point, but a very important and simple economic point. I've got a couple, I think, of Kipling poems, one of which is about the Afghan War. And while he happens to be writing about the Afghan War of 100 and some years ago, he could be writing about the present one, because what it's really about is the economics of conflict between developed and undeveloped societies on the undeveloped society's terrain. And he's pointing out that the undeveloped society has some real advantages. Uh, the the title of the poem is Arithmetic on the Frontier. You can find it. And I remember one bit of it is, one sword knot stolen from the camp will pay for all the school expenses of any Huron Valley scamp who knows no word of moods or tenses, but being blessed with perfect sight, picks off our messmates left and right. With homebred hordes the hillsides teem, our troop ships bring us one by one, at vast expense of time and steam, to slay Afrides where they run. The captives of our bow and spear are cheap, alas, as we are dear. So that's a point, and it's a point that's still true about the trade-offs of cost between the advantages and disadvantages. And I then combine that, I think, with some bits from The Wealth of Nations, where Adam Smith is discussing the fact that in antiquity, the barbarians were always a threat to the civilized people, whereas in the 18th century, when he's writing, the civilized people are a threat to the barbarians, and he's discussing the economic reasons for that change, which is basically, though he doesn't use that language, the shift from a labor-intensive to a capital-intensive military technology. So those are all cases where somebody smart is saying something interesting and clever relevant to economics. So if you want to look at those, my idea is to have for each of those an essay by me discussing economics. And I've written about half the essays and haven't worked on that for, I don't know, 6 months or something, but I may get back to that. And the problem with doing it as a book, which is my original plan, is that many of the works are under copyright. And negotiating copyright permission for all of them would be a real pain. So one possibility is I can do it as a web page, because most of the works are webbed somewhere and I can just link to it. I could do it as a book and have the full text of works that are not under copyright and then just a URL for works that are. But I'm not sure I'll end up doing either of those. But that was sort of an interesting project, which I may get back to. And if any of you can think of short works of literature that have interesting economic insights, I would be happy to hear about them. And if you will want to see my list, if you go to my webpage and you look around a bit, you should be able to find the link to that project.
I got two more, one thing a little quicker and another thing a little slower about World of Warcraft, where I was browsing today and I found a photo of you on the World of Warcraft subreddit playing at the Libertarian Conference, and that was already funny, but then when I saw you actually had responded to somebody on the comment, I was laughing so hard at that.
Well, apparently, I'm told that picture went viral. I assume part of the reason it went viral was that there are lots of people much younger than I am, who play World of Warcraft and are told by their parents that that's a childish thing to do. And here there was a professor doing it, which sort of supported their side of it.
Yeah, and it was funny just the setting it was in, where it was very funny. But another thing with World of Warcraft is that I find it very interesting how the economy of World of Warcraft moved into the real world for countries that needed it, like Venezuela. And at one point it became so crucial that a blackout in the country caused a crash in the economy in the game. So I wanted to hear what's your take on that.
That is, the fact that you get gold miners is sort of neat. I should say I'm not really playing World of Warcraft at the moment. I stopped playing quite a while ago. I went back when they brought out Classic, and I like Classic better than I like the current version. But at some point a few months ago, I got bored with it, so I may or may not go back at this point. Mostly it's just that I find enough other interesting things to do that I don't feel like spending the amount of time that takes. At this point, my wife plays a good deal. I think my daughter may be back to it. She went back at least for a while with Classic. And I'm not playing, and my younger son, who lives with us, isn't playing. For a while, all four of us were playing, and that was sort of fun, having a family guild, as it were. But no, World of Warcraft was very interesting. Something a little bit related to that, though not very much, that I've been getting interested in recently is the question of how you could do the equivalent of a meetup or a science fiction convention or a libertarian convention online. Because the trouble with something like Zoom that we're using at the moment is that it's really a one-to-many interaction, so that there is one conversation going on at a time, there is generally a speaker and an audience, and some interaction between them. Whereas if you think about the kind of event I'm describing, it's a bunch of different conversations. So if I imagine a meetup of the people who read the blog that I like reading, which we host at our house sometimes, there are several conversations going on, and you can wander around the room or several rooms, find a conversation you're interested in, and join it. And it turns out that there is software presently available for free, which lets you do that online, and it's called Mozilla Hubs. And I suggest that anybody who would like to organize such things should investigate it. You can build your own location. I've built my own sort of 4-room meeting place for people to do that in. And I'm planning this afternoon to try to host a meetup. I don't know if anybody will come. But part of the neat thing about doing that sort of thing is that geography vanishes. So if you do it and have an interesting social event, that interesting social event can have people coming from Australia and Korea and China and France and UK and Iceland and wherever else there are people who happen to share whatever your interests are.
There are also games that have like proximity chat, like virtual open world games, where when you get close to other players, you can hear each other talk on like over the microphone, basically.
Yeah,
and that's kind of similar to what you're talking about.
That's right. The way Mozilla Hubs works, the essential characteristic, which I had been wanting somebody to do and then discovered they'd already done, is that the farther away you are from somebody, the weaker the sound is. So that means that if you're a cluster of people in the next room, I'm not going to hear them. But I can walk over to the next room, get close enough to overhear them, say, yeah, it's an interesting conversation, and walk over and join it. And yeah, I've been thinking I ought to see if I could persuade the people at Students for Liberty that they ought to be taking advantage of this technology, because it would work very well for the sort of thing they do. They canceled their annual DC get-together, and this might be a substitute for it.
Very interesting.
That would be cool because I'm the vice president of Students for Liberty on my campus. So
Well, pass the word on. But
Yeah.
if you normally have meetups, take a look at Mozilla Hubs. If you want to correspond by email, I will be happy to point you at the meetup place the scene that I created, and you can create a version of that. Copy that, well, basically use that scene. I haven't figured out exactly how you get somebody else's scenes, but I'm sure there's some way of doing it because it is saved to Mozilla Hubs. Anyway,
Cool.
So great.
Well, Dr. Friedman, before we go on to the next set of questions, will just be questions about yourself, a little quick questions. Is there anything you would like to promote?
Well, I'd like more people to try reading my novels. I am not the world's best novelist. I've been recently reading and rereading some novels, science fiction novels by one of my favorite authors, the Foreigner books by Cherry, which are extraordinarily good, and one result of reading them is appreciating how much better she is than I am. But I think the novels I have written are sufficiently unlike anybody else's novels so that for some people they will be worth reading. I enjoy reading and rereading them. And there are 3 of them. Harold was published commercially by Bain, and Harold was marketed as a fantasy, but what it really is a historical novel with made-up history, because I don't have any magic, I don't have any elves or dwarves or anything of that sort. But on the other hand, there is no actual time and place that corresponds to what's happening in the story. My other 2 novels, one of which is a sequel to the other, Salamander and Brothers, actually are fantasies. They're the kind of fantasy in which magic is a science. And in fact, part of what's going on in those is that they're set about 50 years after the magical equivalent of Newton. So you have somebody who about 50 years earlier took the first big steps to converting magic from a craft to a science. And things change very slowly, as in most societies, and the effect of what he's done is beginning to work its way through the society. And I think succeed in doing a pretty good job of faking the idea of having a real science there. That is, of having thought through the top levels of what the science looks like, inspired partly by some features of quantum mechanics, of mathematics of quantum mechanics. I don't really have it. I can't really write the text, the equivalent of a college textbook for my magical system, but I think I create the illusion that I can. And the most common complaint I see is that my characters are too rational, too reasonable. And That's fine. That's the kind of people I like writing about. I'm always irritated if I'm reading something and people are doing stupid things. Some people will like that and some won't. And my greatest weakness as a novelist is that I'm a softie. And so I'm not willing to have terrible things happen to characters I like. And that's too bad because that reduces my ability to create tension. And presumably somebody who's read the halfway through the novel has probably figured out that I'm not going to kill off the protagonist or anybody else really important. But nonetheless, I think they're pretty good books, and I hope that some people will read them and enjoy them.
I've been thinking about checking them out myself, so yeah, I'll be sure to look into them. So the first question I wanted to ask for this quick section is, I'm sure many of us who host this podcast and just many of our listeners can kind of relate to you, maybe, because this is what the question is about, in how you grew up with a father that was for limited government, was conservative in his policies, whereas you, of course, are an anarchist and a little more radical looking at how you would approach things. So my question is, what was it like growing up with that with him as a father?
To begin with, my father was a classical liberal, not a conservative.
Oh, okay.
That of his achievements, one of the ones he was proudest of was his role in ending the draft, for example. But no, I think my father was one of the best people I've ever known. That in general, we spent lots of time arguing, and the question was always not who is older, but who has a better argument, and which is, I think, the way it ought to be. So no, he was a highly intelligent, very reasonable person. If you want a portrait of him, by the way, a written portrait, Leo Ralston was a moderately prominent novelist and short story writer. And he was also a friend of my parents. And one of his books is called something like People I Have Known, Loved, Admired. And it's a bunch of essays about many, many different people, including George Washington. But one of them is about my father, although he doesn't tell his real name. It's called something like An Irritating Man or some title like that. And it's really quite a charming portrait of what he was like. So no, it was very nice. I don't think I could have done better for parents for myself. My father's view was that the anarchist system I described might work, but probably wouldn't. And my view was that it might not work, but probably would. And that's not the sort of thing one can really settle by theoretical arguments very well. I would say probably the biggest difference between us politically was not in our views, but in our interests. That what he was interested first in economics as a science. That was, I think, he as he put it, that his profession was economics, his hobby was politics. But in terms of his political involvement, what he was interested in was ways of altering the present society to make it a more libertarian society. Whereas what I was interested in was figuring out what the ideal society would be like. And those are very different projects. So you would not have vouchers in my ideal society, but I think he was correct that instituting vouchers would be an enormous improvement and an enormous shift in the right direction in existing society. Similarly with a variety of other things that I don't know whether he thought there ought to be a central bank. He certainly did not think that the Federal Reserve was a useful institution. I think I came across a quote from him somewhere saying that as far as he could remember, he had always been opposed to the Federal Reserve System. But I'm not sure he would have disagreed with my view about private competing monies, but he was mostly interested was, given that we do have the Federal Reserve, how it ought it to behave to do as little damage and as much good as possible. And that was what he made arguments about.
All right. Well, one more question before we wrap up, and this is just one really quick one that I was wondering about. So I was watching some of your old debates from like the 70s and 80s, and one of them was you were debating the side of economics against the side of ethics as being a way to appeal.
With George Smith, I think.
Yes. And during that debate, you had a big medallion chain. And then another speech, when the person introduced you, they said you wore that medallion for quite a while during the 70s. So I wanted to ask, what's up with that?
It was just for fun. I created a very large, I've still got it. It's in a drawer. It's a large medallion with my idea of a proper symbol for libertarians. And it had a torch of liberty and a ball and chain, and the ball and chain was being burned through by the flame of the torch. And the bottom half of it was the word Tannstaffel. And I think the torch was sitting on top of maybe the middle T or something of Tannstaffel. If you're really, I might be able to find it, but I'm not sure if it's worth digging it up. But no, that was something that I thought was fun. I was, at the time, I think I was a graduate student in physics. I had access to a workshop that I was a theorist, but it was more useful, I think, for the experimentalists, and could use that to make stuff. And so I made that particular big medallion. But it was a very long time since I've worn it.
Yeah.
If we ever find that, a picture of it somewhere, that might have to be the thumbnail for this episode.
And also, if we ever start doing merchandise, would you mind if we use that design? Because that actually sounds very fun.
Not at all.
Well, Dr. Friedman, thank you. We would love to have you back sometime.
Sure.
Just thank you so much for your time. This has been a great, fun episode, and I can't wait for our listeners to hear this. So, just
thank you. But let me know. Email me a link to this so that I can put it up if I want on my webpage.
Oh yes,
Well,
of course.
All right, thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.